to Joburg Jan, it contradicts, this view about non-involvement of young men as fathers. And in the book, he talks about, I didn't want her to feel like she's alone. We are together in this. And I'm hoping there are no teachers in the audience, because he then also said, look, along the way, because she was very tired, and I said, look, you can't leave school, but in between, obviously we are not in the same class. The girl was in the lower grade. I'll find a way of also doing some homeworks for you. And I'll also talk to your classmates, and ask them for the notes. Can those practices be counted as positive experiences of fatherhood? Of being a young teenage father? But what you read with these other transcripts, with Timothy, I can't just do things without thinking first. Now when I have money, I can't just go out. And to me says, I have a lot of experiences like money. I have money, but I have to keep it. So what you're seeing here is about the challenges and everything. But also when you read these transcripts closely, is that now the concept of money, it can't just be used to buy cigarette. It can't just be used to buy Zolo. It has to be saved. And it has to be used in meeting the child's needs. And in the book you read about now, Opa saying, no, I need to find a work. I need to find work, and then in between balance my schoolwork and work and was about teenage fathers' understanding of fatherhood and its relationship with the absence of the father figures. And again, I think Wessel's presentation covered this, the two presentations last week covered this theme quite extensively. But what we see in the transcripts is that I want to do things for my child so that she can have a better life than I did. Guide her not to experience the things that I did due to a lack of a father figure in my life. It is painful growing, not knowing your father. I really want to be a different father. And Nelson continues, yes, I'll talk to him about sex and teenage pregnancy because I do not want him to do the mistakes I did. I also want to show him love and care. And we'll have this conversation later after Professor Mzikazi Nduna's presentation. Because in here, the simple argument that I'm making, which in the book, I make psychoanalytic interpretations about how pain was used as sort of productive. All of them saying, I want to be a different father. So the absent, in this case, motivated this young man in wanting to be different as compared to their absent fathers. So again, it contradicts this notion of you have not had a father and then you're more likely to repeat. Though obviously, the some, despite making the commitments, later you begin to see some slippages. The fifth theme is about relationships with mothers. So obviously here, the key theme is about relationship with mothers of their children. The literature says once the girl comes to say I'm pregnant, then is the end of the relationship. A boy disappears. He is nowhere to be seen. But in this sample, and I think even in Shaline's work, in Arvind Banner's work, in Devia Banner's work, you see what I'm seeing in this study. That in fact, many of them continued to be in relationship with mothers of their children, but not all of them. Some sort of ended. But when you look, it was about the issue of provision, the inability to provide, which in the eyes of sisters of the girlfriend was seen as not good enough. The issue of the mother of the girlfriend feeling, no, I mean, the fact that your boyfriend did not pay intlaulo, or he cannot come here willy-nilly to come and see the child. So many of them, they attribute for those that relationships ended, they ended because of an interference of the sister of the girlfriend or the mother of the girlfriend. But I'm not negating the fact that there may also be issues in terms of their relationships. The last theme, it's about the paradoxes of teenage fatherhood. And I guess this, for me, it applies even to the previous presentations, and the discussions about fatherhood, which again, even if you're to think about motherhood, the joys of motherhood, to say everyone must be happy that they are mothers. So obviously here we also need to talk about the pain, the tensions, and the contradictions of fatherhood. So that fatherhood is not presented as this idealistic identity, you making sacrifices, you being a good dad, and we don't talk about the sadness that comes with it. We don't talk about, because with motherhood we can talk about postnatal depression, for an example. There's also a psychiatric term that one can draw on, I guess given its long sort of history. But what we have seen, even with discourses around motherhood, is that if you're a mother, you feel tired, you feel exhausted, maybe psychologically at times you have angry feelings towards your children, then your motherhood may be questioned. To say there's something wrong with you. So obviously here, when I say the paradoxes, it's about where some of the boys, we're feeling this sense of loss, which is when I repeat some of the extracts, because with those extracts that you see around, I have money now, but now I cannot use money for this. There's a bit of sadness that comes with it. There's a sense of loss that comes with it. There's a sense of I can no longer do things like the way I did them before. So which at times it is seen as a responsibility that one needs to sort of carry. But also what you're seeing is that for some it becomes an opportunity to grow. And they talk about, in fact, I feel like I've grown out of this experience. I can no longer behave like a typical teenager. And when you read the work of Katrina MacLeod, around teenage pregnancy, she makes a similar sort of argument, deconstructing the whole notion of teenage pregnancy as a crisis. So my concluding remarks is that despite their lack of positive fathering experience, the participants in the present study were emotionally invested in being good fathers. This is contrary to the dominant literature that hold that teenage fathers who grew up without positive role models or father figures are more likely to become poor role models themselves. The present study showed that the participants' mothers were now grandparents, supported their grandchildren, and encouraged their sons to be good fathers. But again, then we need to, I guess the study that is missing here is about grandparents. With that absent, present, absent. I'm waiting. How do you feel as a father that your son is now having a child? And if I were to share without revealing an identity of my uncle, I've not yet spoken to him, but I was told by one of my cousins that his second born, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, he came home And I think it was his way of breaking the news. And he said, Dad, next year, Father's Day, we'll be celebrating it together. Because we'll be celebrating Father's Day, but not you as my father. And he left it there. And apparently my uncle is still troubled. He doesn't even know how to go back to the boy, you know, to say, what did you mean? And he has been calling around, and even my aunt has been calling my other aunts, you know, to say, hey, this boy came home and he said this, and we're just reading between the lines, you know, to say maybe he meant this. So in respect of this, the findings of this study regarding teenage paternity, although based on a very small sample, I mean, in the book, obviously I cover 3, but in the whole study, it's like about 16 of them, suggest that boys may be more willing to shoulder responsibility in this regard than it is generally thought and expected. And I guess that would be the conclusion of my, presentation. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Malose, for that very rich presentation. It really brought up familiar but also surprising themes. I want to check if our technical support team is able to show the results of the poll, and then I'll just make a brief comment. So the overwhelming, almost 100% of people agreed that teenage fathers need positive male father figures to become better fathers themselves. So just in response, Malose, I am not going to ask questions. I'm just going to add 3 observations that I drew from your presentation. And I think the poll question about the fact that teenage fathers need positive male role models was quite interesting, especially since you mentioned that the teenage fathers were very much concerned about their own mothers' reactions to the news that their sons were becoming parents and that the mothers were becoming grandmothers. I think across a few of your themes, the familiar aspect of the relationship between paternity, fatherhood, and money came up in terms of inhlahulo, but also provision. And I was very provoked by your question of whether inhlahulo is dying out as a tradition. I think that's a very interesting question to unpack and to explore. I was also quite moved by your account of the reality of pain and the way that pain can be used productively by the teenage fathers, but also in terms of the acceptance of fatherhood generally, that it is not necessarily an idealistic, romanticized construction that might be imagined by those who are not necessarily doing the fatherhood. And I also really acknowledge and appreciate your call for research into the double layer of intergenerational parenting, where those absent fathers or fathers who are not involved, or the mothers and the teenage fathers and the children, for us to learn more about how the parents of those who have just become parents experience their offspring's parenthood. It's a really interesting terrain, and I really thank you for a very rich presentation. We have documented, there have been lots of questions and answers in the question and answer box. We have documented them, and we will move to them at the end of the presentation after Professor Nduna's presentation. Thank you to all of the participants and the attendees. We have 166 participants in this call, and there's a vibrant conversation going. We would love to hear more of your comments. Remember, the hashtag for social media is #FathersMatterSZA. And then before we pass to Professor Nduna, we would like to share a short introductory video related to this from Heartlines. Thank you.
write about boys. I have like 2 children who are girls, and I'm able to see the huge difference. And the difference is that girls are free in expressing their feelings and emotions.
You're going to be all hardcore. You're going to be, aggressive, and you're going to take what you want, and in work you're going to walk over people and get it. Men are not supposed to discuss their feelings.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask Levu to stop there. It seems like the visual feed was not going through. So can I offer apologies for that brief technical glitch there? We are still learning, and it's okay to be learning as we move along. I think we will attempt to show the film again at the end for those who are interested in watching it. So for now, I would like to pass to the second polling question, and the question is whether you prefer beef or chicken. That was my little joke. They asked me not to make corny jokes, but I thought that was an option we don't often get these days now that we are not flying. So there's the question on the screen. Please answer and the question that you prefer. And then I would like to ask that we can put Professor Nduna's bio on the slide, and I will introduce our second panelist, who I'm very happy to introduce, Associate Professor in Psychology, Mzikazi Nduna. She is an educator, a facilitator, a researcher, and an advocate. She is the author of A Magnifying Glass and a Fine-Tooth Comb, Understanding Girls and Young Women's Vulnerability, which we are, I want to share my congratulations, Prof. Nduna and Mzikazi, because it is a wonderful book and it is available as a free publication. So I will now hand over to Mzikazi to do her presentation. Thank you, Mzi.
Thank you very much, Wessel. I need Professor Langa to stop sharing his presentation so that I'm able to share mine. I think that's what it says. Okay, that's not what I wanted to share. Oh.
It's a lovely picture of Cape Point that we can see at the moment.
I know, but I need to share something that is not Cape Point. I need to share the slides.
There we go.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, I think you can go into a
okay. Thank you.
presentation.
Thank you very much. So I have been asked to speak about gender-based violence, including femicide and further connections today. I think I've been asked to speak on this topic because this is the topic that I ordinarily work on. I work on the topic of gender-based violence and specifically gender-based violence against women for purposes of this meeting. It's important that I clarify that my work is biased towards working on and understanding and preventing gender-based violence against women, including femicide. I also work on father disconnections, and the way I got into the topic of father disconnections explains why I again bring the bias into the work that I do. I got into this work because of my interest in young women's sexuality. And that work around young women's sexuality then taught me something about the circumstances under which adolescent girls and young women get pregnant and what happens when they have been pregnant and what are their concerns around their pregnancy. And that is why my work is not on father absence per se, but on father disconnections. But I know that there is an overlap between what I call father disconnections and what is called father absence most of the time. So what we're going to do in the next 15 minutes that I have been afforded is to look at two things. We're going to look at the relationship between gender-based violence and father disconnections. And then we'll look at the relationship between father disconnections and gender-based violence. And I will identify a few unknowns for me. So I did not prepare this presentation as a research presentation because I did not think that this was a research webinar. So I hope that I will still present something that is useful for you. I also make assumptions all the time when I'm I'm going to give these presentations. And one of the assumptions that I'm making for today is that almost everyone who is in this webinar today, since we have 161 people and those who will be watching it later, they know what is gender-based violence is. So I'm not going to go into the World Health Organization's definitions of gender-based violence, because I think people know what gender-based violence is. I also think that people know what father disconnections refers to. Maybe it kind of refers to father absence, but maybe not. But I think we have an idea of what we're talking about. I think we can also agree that, again, because of my bias, I'm not talking about the other people, I'm talking about women because of my interest. We can agree that both gender-based violence and father connections affect women and children in many and in varied ways. Please always remember, when I, Mzikazi Nduna, say something affects a particular group, I am not saying it doesn't affect the other group. So I'm not speaking against or for the other group. I'm speaking for this topic that I'm talking about. So an examination of the links between gender-based violence, including femicide and absent fathers, is important, because when we examine these links, we are able to identify what research is required that looks at the intersections between gender-based violence and absent fathers, which is something that we have not quite done in this country. It's very sad that we have not done this in this country, because both gender-based violence and absent fathers or father disconnections are actually at a proportion that suggests that we should be doing a lot of research around these two topics. Yes, we've done quite a lot on GBV alone, but not in relation to absent fathers or father disconnections. We seem to have taken quite a while to get into the topic of father disconnections or absent fathers. Also, when we do this examination, we are able to identify areas that require interventions, legal interventions, policy interventions, and behavior change interventions. And I want to say, having had the privilege to read in this area over the past decade, I think that we need more information that is going to help us, because there's a lot of legal loopholes in this area. There's a lot of policy loopholes. There's a lot of behavior change opportunities in this area. Understanding gender-based violence is not easy. I do want to say that it is not easy. It requires that we develop as a country gender expertise in research, and that is something that is as urgent as yesterday, that we need to develop this. This is an example of a tool that is currently being circulated. I received it, I think, on Monday, if not Sunday. So I received it this recent, and the tool is a survey. The tool is a survey on gender-based violence, and I'm sure if you work on gender-based violence and you are in this webinar now, you can see that those questions are not going to take the researchers anywhere. And I opened the tool. I also received it on WhatsApp. I'm sure some of you have received it. I did the first page, which was more demographics, and then the second page, I think these questions were on the third page, and the questions read as they are here. Have you ever experienced gender-based violence? And the next question was, do you know someone who has experienced gender-based violence? At which point I then clicked the close exit survey, because I did not think that it was useful for me to spend my time answering questions that are so obvious. Every other woman in this country and in this society experiences some kind of gender-based violence. The questions we should be asking are, what kinds of gender-based violence have you experienced in the past day, 2 days, week, or months, or years? I know that there are people who come from a position that thinks that, no, it is not everybody who experiences gender-based violence, but I think it's because we don't do enough analysis of what gender-based violence is, because we focus a lot on the psychological violence in intimate relationships, we focus on physical violence in intimate relationships, and we focus on sexual violence in and outside of intimate relationships. So because of our focus as researchers who work on gender-based violence, on these types of violence, we forget that in our everyday lives as women, we are subjected to patriarchy, and patriarchy is by its nature violent. Every day of our lives, there is some kind of violation that happens, but our network or antenna for violations against women is not high enough for us to pick this up every day of our lives. So I don't think that answering questions about whether anyone has experienced any violence is going to be useful information. I think that it's okay. People can continue with these surveys. I also think that it's okay. People can continue with surveys of psychological, physical, and sexual violence. But I think there is more to violence against women that we need to understand, especially from a structural violence point of view. Because these sort of violations that are readily visible to us, like you've been slapped or you've been kicked or someone said something nasty in front of your friends to you, or that you were raped, that is the kind of violence that is accessible to us. But a lot of violence that is not readily accessible to us is what is humiliating and is killing women. So I think it's very important that we think about that. So gender-based violence, including femicide, disproportionately affects women and children, and it is mainly perpetrated by men. And I know that I'm one woman amongst a few men in this series of webinars. And so if they don't agree with me, it's okay. They are not women, so they don't experience what we experience from men every day. But if you speak to women, even the women who have not thought that they've experienced violence, once you start talking to them and unpacking structural violence, that's when in fact you get a lot of nods in the room. What we do not know is if these men who perpetrate this violence against women are fathers or become fathers, but we can safely assume so, that if they are not fathers at the time they perpetrate these kinds of crimes or atrocities or abuse and violence, they will become fathers at some point. That is not the only point at which the intersection between violence against women and father disconnections happens. There is emerging evidence that gender-based violence, including femicide, may be linked to father disconnections in a number of ways. So when we talk about father disconnections, I wanted to populate these slides by figures in terms of how many children in South Africa do not live with their fathers, have absent fathers, or are not connected to their fathers. And then that's an exercise that's very difficult for us to do. We do play with these numbers. Some studies suggest that is 30%, some 40%, some 50%, some even 60%. There is a study from Mpumalanga that I read a couple of years ago. I think it was from the HSRC, which suggested that up to 60% of young people in that particular sample had reported not growing up or living with their fathers. So there was father absence or disconnection that was happening. So even though I wanted to populate this slide with these statistics, I decided that, again, because of the complexities and the nuances of the concept of father connection and disconnection from the work that we read, it's very difficult for us to know, because sometimes the children themselves do not know that they do not live with their fathers. They think that they are with their fathers when they are not with their fathers. So there is a lot of work that still needs to happen in terms of surveys, in terms of father connections. But we do know that from the legal research that has been conducted, Black African children are mostly affected by the concept of father absence or disconnections. And again, there's a list of reasons that is offered in literature about why Black children are mostly affected by this. We also know that fathers can be absent in the lives of their children fully, which means 100% absent. I've never seen this man, I'm so disconnected from him, or partially. So sometimes they are there, sometimes they are not there, or they are not there, but you know, they pay you know, whatever needs to be paid. So economically, I've got a relationship with my father, but not physically and emotionally. So there are all these differences in terms of how fathers are present or not present in their children's lives. So how do we get to understand the relationship between gender-based violence and father disconnections? Father disconnections may result from rape. I think we all agree with that. And we all agree that one of the problems that we have in South Africa is incest. And like any other crime, incest is a crime, and from the perpetrator's point of view, they are motivated to conceal the crime. That is why we do not know in this country how much incest is happening. So incest, for those of us who are not familiar with this field, is an act of having sexual relationships or marriage with a close relative from the same bloodline, according to the Criminal Law Amendment Act 32 of 2007. So it is illegal in South Africa to have such a relationship. However, as we have said earlier in this presentation, we need to do more work here so that we can start to inform legal reforms. Because, for example, if we define incest only in relation to bloodline, we are leaving a lot of children outside this definition, who are adopted children, who are fostered children, who are children who by some arrangement end up in our household, but they are not my biological child and they are not my husband's child. And so it means that is not a case of incest because there is no bloodline. So it's very important that we understand the sociological aspects of the phenomenon of parenthood, families, and households and fatherhood in South Africa for us to be able to inform the law. Because of course, we know what has happened to the South African law. We continue to make cosmetic changes to the remnants of the colonial law. And so they may not be a true reflection of the lives of the people of this society. And there is a need, of course, for more research and improved research in the area of incest so that it can inform interventions around incest. We know that father connections may result from statutory rape. And for as long as I've worked in this field, which is about 20-something years ago, there has been this concept of statutory rape that I learned early on when I joined this field. However, even today, we're still battling with statutory rape because, again, like any other crime, there is a motivation to conceal the crime. Nobody wants to go to jail. However, nobody at the time of committing the crime thinks that they might go to jail. Everybody thinks that they will get away with it. Again, I offer this definition, which is the legal definition of statutory rape, which is a form of rape that occurs when someone older than 16 has a sexual relationship with a minor. So in this country, if you are over 18, you are not allowed to have sex with anyone who's age 12, 13, 14, 15. Because those people are considered minors. So if children are going to have sex, which we think they do or we know they do, they are going to have sex amongst each other, but not with older people. So the problem is, again, we need a lot of research to, one, count statutory rape, but like any other crime, we are not counting it because it is mostly committed by people who are known to the victims. And we all, when I say all in inverted commas, work with the perpetrators sometimes to conceal the crime of statutory rape. Rape of a woman by a stranger can also result in further connections. So in terms of this, unlike the first two that I've described, unlike incest and statutory rape, rape of a woman by a stranger could directly link to further disconnections because, of course, the stranger may genuinely not know who the father of their child is. So because the stranger may genuinely not know who the father of the child is, then that immediately disconnects the child from their father. And when we examine the annual police stats in South Africa, what we learn is that there are more chances that a familiar foe, they call it a familiar foe, which is the enemy that you know, which is the perpetrator, which is known. There are more chances that that person will be caught and will be charged compared to a stranger. And that is why we've got reports in South Africa such as the war at home, or reports that suggest that women are unsafe at home. They stand more chances of being sexually violated in their homes compared to in the street. So that could be true, or it may not necessarily be true, because we do not know how much of these violations, because there's in the crime stats, there's very few successes with even apprehending those perpetrators who are unknown. So perpetrators of sexual violence or rape against women who are strangers are less likely to be caught, charged, and sentenced in this country. I hope that that slide alone is convincing you that there is a relationship between gender-based violence and further connections. I now want to move on to something that I have also written about, and I think Professor Langa also mentioned something briefly around Intlawulo, which I'm going to also mention cursory in this presentation. So I've written and read also a bit about disputed, denied, unacknowledged paternity. And both as a woman in South Africa, and a Black woman for that matter, and as a scientist in South Africa, it still disappoints me that there is very little interest in this work. And yet it would seem that there is a lot of this phenomenon that is happening. Like every other qualitative study that I encounter, even if it is not about the acknowledgement of the paternity, if it's about pregnancy, there will always be some kind of description of disputed, denied, or unacknowledged paternity. So I then decided to package that under sexual violence. And the reason why I package that under sexual violence is because in that scenario, you've got to think about it. In that scenario, the alleged father is making a claim that the woman is lying about her sexual experience with him. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. That there's a pregnant woman who is pointing at a particular boy or man as the father of the child. But the father, who is the alleged father at this point, is now making a claim publicly, so most of the time, that this woman is lying. I don't know this woman. I never slept with this woman. And when they do that, they dispute paternity. When they dispute, they take too long to accept that they are responsible for that. And you can tally this with demographics. I looked at the demographic health surveys for a few years, and I looked at when do children report knowing their fathers or living with their fathers. And you can see that they start to have a relationship with their fathers later on in life. So as the children grow, that's when they kind of start to know their fathers and develop as a relationship with their fathers. But when they are still small, there are more children who do not have this kind of a relationship. Because why? Because the alleged father is disputing the paternity and may agree later, and once they agree, then a relationship is formed. But there are fathers who plain out deny. They don't only dispute and then delay, play tactics, move to Cape Town, change cell phone number, and then open a new Facebook account and there are those fathers who will not even try to hide themselves. They don't do that. They just deny. I did not sleep with Mzikazi Nduna. I do not know this woman. Oh, the only time I slept with this woman, I used a condom. Oh, I know that this woman had a main partner and I was a kwapeni. It could not be me. It could be the other partner. And so they deny any involvement of this. Now, it's very important that we understand what these men are doing. These men are making a claim that this woman is lying about her sexual experience with them. If you are following stuff around gender-based violence, you will remember that there was a hashtag at some point in time. I think a lot of it gained traction after the murder of Uyinene, and it was the Me Too hashtag. It was always there, but it gained traction. And then there was a lot on social media about Me Too, and I started also to follow this. And a lot of women were expressing their experiences, which of course were past experiences of sexual violence and rape. And some of them were even mentioning perpetrators on social media that I was raped by Sipho, I was raped by Yanga, I was raped, and they mentioned the date, they would mention that, they would describe what happened. And guess what? Then some men retaliated and started saying they were going to sue these women. And then the women started to fear for their lives because they were going to be sued. We know that not only in social media, those of us who work to defend women's human rights against sexual violence, we get threatened all the time that we will be sued because we are implicating people and these people are describing themselves as innocent. I am yet to see women, because again, we know, I'm saying this knowing very well that it does not happen because of the gender power dynamics and because of patriarchy. I'm yet to hear women saying, we want to know all those men who have disputed pregnancies and then later on accepted these pregnancies because we want to sue them for defamation of character. How can you say for 5 or 10 years that this woman did not sleep with you, that this baby was not yours? And then when the child looks exactly like you, then you start showing an interest. Or when this child is doing well at school, or when this woman passes on, then you go to her family and you start claiming this child, or. So there are circumstances. Or when you go to your own witch doctor in Nyanga, and then they tell you the reason you're not getting a job is because you abandoned your child in Limpopo. And then you go to Limpopo and you start fetching your child. And all these years you have been saying this is not your child. And for men, I want to see women saying, you know what, we're going to sue you. But for men, I want to see all the men whose interest is feminism and whose interest is preventing gender-based violence to stand up themselves and say, we will sue all the men who initially denied any pregnancy that was theirs and later accepted that it is theirs. We're going to sue our fellow men for defamation of character of these good girls. We have not seen that. Why? Because some of the work around gender-based violence that comes from the men's sector is less interested in the impact of gender-based violence on the woman, but more interested in getting a space for men in the table. So that is why we don't make enough progress in defining some of these behaviors that we experience every day as women, as violence against women. Because even men who do this kind of work are less interested in making things easy for the women, but they are more interested in making things easy for men so that they are seen as good feminist men. The last one is unacknowledged paternity. And I think Prof. Langa mentioned something about a process of acknowledging paternity in the society, in the Black society in particular. And again here, I am not generalizing. I am aware that there are pockets of our society where this process does not unfold in this way, or it has been abandoned by some people, or some couples, they just discuss between themselves and then they decide what to do. However, the customary way has always been that the pregnant girl will be presented to the boy's family so that some responsibility or accountability process takes place. But we know that when he does not acknowledge the pregnancy in the ways that is expected in her family. For example, by paying something. So there is something that the boy's family or the man should pay to her family to acknowledge, formally acknowledge the pregnancy. Because whatever they charge him then is taken by these two families to be building a relationship between these two parents so that he has access to the child. And in instances where he has not acknowledged the pregnancy, we find that sometimes he struggles to have access to his child. And I think Professor Langa was right in pointing that out, that it does create a disconnection because of the expectations that were not fulfilled. We also know about domestic violence. I'm not going to dwell much on this because I think this is the one that we are mostly familiar with, that domestic violence may lead to a marriage dissolution or relationship breakup, leading to further disconnections, restraining orders, separation, divorce, and maybe one of the partners remarries, and when they marry somebody else, then it's difficult for them to have access to their child. Either the woman marries somebody else or the man marries somebody else, and then that creates some disconnection. But also we are starting to see something now about the concept of parental alienation, which is a psychological concept that refers to manipulation, where the parent manipulates a child against the other parent. Femicide is a big problem in South Africa. It is one form of gender-based violence, and I've got to touch base with this because it is important. Femicide results in a separation of a mother from her children. We know that femicide is described as homicide of female-bodied persons. So it's when women are being murdered. So it doesn't matter what the relationship between these two, or between the perpetrator and the victim of femicide. But sometimes it happens that when the woman is dead, if they had a child and the child did not know their father at the point of the murder, then the source of link, the link between the child and the putative father or the alleged father, because remember they dispute and deny and delay for a while. And then if it happened, unfortunately, that she dies of femicide, whether from this or another partner, then that may create a knowledge gap because the child may not know who their father is, because the person who was going to help them trace their father is not there. There's also intimate femicide.
Mzikazi, I'm just going to give you a gentle nudge for time. We've gone over our time and we still want to open for questions and answers.
This is the second last slide. Thank you. Okay. So the intimate femicide here results in a separation, of course, of the surviving children from their father, because sometimes the family of the deceased woman might be worried about allowing the children or the child to have access with the perpetrator. And then there's suicide femicide, where the man kills the partner but also kills themselves and disconnecting himself from his children through that. So we know that also further disconnections is associated with more life trauma and distress. And there is evidence from a few studies that are conducted in South Africa that suggest that people who grow up with absent fathers tend to be treated differently in their maternal homes. As a result, they may suffer physical, sexual, emotional abuse, which is perpetrated by significant others, uncles and aunts. And whilst we know that from qualitative studies, we don't know how prevalent that is. But we do know that children who grow up with an absent biological father tend to display more behavioral problems, including sexual abuse, child sexual abuse. So there is evidence to that. Last slide, Chairperson. There's a few unknowns. I already inserted a few unknowns when I was presenting, because I'm hoping that some researchers in the webinar will pick those unknowns up. We do not know what is the complex link between gender-based violence and absent fathers, apart from what I've tried to describe, which I think is very simplistic. We also do not know whether father absence predisposes children who grow up with an absent biological father to perpetrate gender-based violence. But if this is probably, we do not know how this happens. So the mechanism by which father absence predisposes children who grow up with an absent father. We also do not know how much is the maltreatment of children in their maternal homes and what form this maltreatment takes, and what puts these children at risk of maltreatment. And lastly, we do not know if that varies by the gender of the child. So I hope that these unknowns are going to result in new research questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mzi. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. I've made lots of notes, and I can see there's lots of questions and comments in the comment notes. Just to pick up two things from what you were saying, I think a fish did not invent water. So that survey that you questioned about, it's a good assumption to make that most people know somebody who has experienced gender-based violence, and being quite specific about asking the types of questions is a useful step to take. I liked your phrase, the cosmetic changes to remnants of colonial law, pushing us to be very transformative in how deep we transform the policy environment we work in. And then I noticed the common factor of the need to conceal these various instances of incest and the kinds of rape. I really heard you when you were talking about the disrupted, disputed paternity as a form of violence, when that interaction is not acknowledged, and that is a form of sexual violence. And then I also, I wholeheartedly agree, even though you are the one who's putting it into the conversation, but I agree with the concern about conversations where men are involved in trying to reduce gender-based violence, ending up creating more space for men, rather than, and I think that was a very good way to frame it, rather than necessarily driving the feminist concerns that we could achieve. So thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation. I do note to participants that we did collect all of your questions and questions. We will not have time to go through all of them, and we will send out a set of questions to the presenters for them to answer in their own time, if they have the time to do that after this presentation. Before we go into the questions and answers, I would like to just ask for the last poll question of the day. So just to put the last polling question up. And this was the results from the previous one. So whether there's a connection between gender-based violence and absent fathers, and most people seem to agree with you. And here is the question: what is required to overcome toxic masculinities in South Africa? And then can I ask that we try the video again before we go into the final question and answer round? Thank you.
I write about boys. I have 2 children who are girls, and I'm able to see the huge difference. And the difference is that girls are free in expressing their feelings and emotions.
You're going to be all hardcore. You're going to be, aggressive, and you're going to take what you want, and in work you're going to walk over people and get it.
Men are not supposed to discuss their feelings.
Boys don't cry. Pull yourself together. Don't show your feelings. Man up. Those are the sort of stereotypes that need to be challenged.
You cannot separate gender-based violence from toxic masculinity. Gender-based violence happens on the belief that women must be subordinated, women must be controlled, and obviously when women refuse to be controlled, they get subjected to all forms of violence.
Men have to call men out. Men have to hold each other accountable and say, dude, you can't do that.
If boy children were to be allowed, even at a very, very young age, to express those feelings and emotions, they're more likely to grow up and be healthy individuals.
I'm convinced that better men make better husbands and better fathers.
In terms of how we're raising the boys and the girls in our household, there's a lot of undoing from our upbringing and general culture that we have to be aware of.
There's a thinking out there that if you are not a tough father, you're going to raise a weak child. And that is, there's so many things wrong with the way we look at that and the way we think about that.
Men have to teach boys what it means to be a good man, because boys do what their fathers do.
Thank you so much for sharing that wonderful film. So we are going into the question and answer session of the webinar now. I want to again reiterate a huge vote of thanks to Prof. Langa and to Prof. Nduna for your presentations. Excuse me. We tried our best to group the questions and to highlight them. We will see how far we can get in the responses. So I have a few questions, and like I mentioned, we will also try and answer some of them after the webinar. Remember that this is a series, so some questions that are asked can be answered in the upcoming webinars. So the first one is to you, Malose, and the question is, how do men become fathers when they have never experienced being fathered?
Oh, I thought I'll take a couple of questions.
I can provide. Okay, let me give three questions.
I think that's better than one.
Sure.
It will take.
Thank you. So the first one is that one. How do men become fathers when they have never experienced being fathered? The second one is, what is needed to support teenage fathers to prevent them from acting out in accordance with gender norms? And the third one is, how much of the paternal refusal, or maybe refusal of paternity, was psychological, and how much was based on economics and culture? So there are three questions.
Thanks, Wessel. Yeah, I guess the last one, Professor Nduna will also chip in about the refusal. But obviously, if I were to answer based on my study and sort of my experience, the refusal mainly was more sort of economic. But I also want to argue, I guess the shock because others immediately they refuse, and then they will want to talk to the partner to say, and you hear this more often, you know, the entertainment about why don't we sort of like abort, like, you know, the child, and so obviously if you're to talk about, and which in the literature you find a lot on how women deal with getting the news that they're pregnant, you know, and I guess the feelings that they go through until they reach like an acceptance. But with men, we do not have documented sort of like, you know, experiences of what sort of like, you know, happens. So I'm of the view to say similar feelings do happen with, like, you know, young men, where the initial reaction, it may be that of, no, it's not me, and later some begin to process the news until they sort of like, you know, like accept. And I guess in terms of the support, I mean, I guess conversations such as this, I mean, also I guess the video that you showed and the upcoming and even previous, like, you know, media, like, you know, campaigns have made a huge, like, you know, difference. Because I think the tendency with many of these, like, you know, conversations, we also do not acknowledge the positives that are happening. If we go back, I mean, to the work of Ulinda Richter, for an example, Lubaba and everything, and you check the period in which the text was sort of like, you know, written, already there you're beginning to see positive voices of, like, you know, fatherhood. And now, even in terms of the quick surveys that you have done, like, you know, right now, you begin to see a shift. Okay, so obviously I do not have a ready-made, like, you know, recommendations, you know, to say this is what you need to do, this is what you need to do. But I'm of the view to say one of the tools that we can use, it to be that of media. One of the tools is to have conversations like this. One of the tools is to have conversation with young men in different, like, you know, communities. If we look at the attendance here, we more than 100. Okay, so if one of us was to commit to say, out of this, like, you know, conversation, I'm going to have a conversation with my brother or my cousin or my son, it snowballs. Okay, and then the first question, like, around, if you have not been, like, you know, fathered, how would you know how to sort of, like, you know, father? And I guess it links with your presentation, Wessel, like, around who is a father, because often we refer to the biological, like, you know, father. And our presentation last week was that we have, like, you know, so many fathers, and it doesn't mean to, it does not refer to your biological, like, you know, father. You could have brothers, you could have uncles, you could have grandparents, and, you know, I guess you can also learn, like, you know, from other people. But again, if the media gives a wrong, like, you know, message, then messages, we're giving conflicting messages in between. Because with South Africans watch a lot of soapies, and I said this in different conversations. But when you watch many of the soapies, the scripts are very normative, and they're not providing alternative, like, you know, voices. So I'm hoping with communication, people in this, like, you know, space will begin to challenge some of those, like, you know, narratives, and then we'll continue to make, like, a good, like, you know, progress.
Thank you so much, Malose. Mzikazi, I'm going to pass to you the three questions that we have collected. The first one is, if men are raised by single mothers and turn out to be toxic and abusive, do we blame the absent fathers or how the mother raised them? Is the first one. The second one is, what are the psychological factors that lead to gender-based violence? And is there any research on this? And the third one is asking, are we concluding that father disconnections lead to gender-based violence?
Okay, hello.
Go ahead, Mzikazi, we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So thank you for those questions. So the first question was, if boys were raised by their mothers and then they turn out to be violent, do we blame those mothers? Am I correct?
So do we blame the single mother or the absent father?
Okay. I think we should blame the society, because it is the society that raises children. It's very easy to think that children are raised by their single mothers because they live in the same household with their single mothers. But most of these single mothers do not beat their partners. And so where do these boys learn that people beat their partners? Because they don't see their mother perpetrating violence on the partner. They don't see their mother abusing drugs, but they still can take drugs. They don't see their mother leaving school. They don't see their mother. So all those things that boys do and then they become violent, they don't necessarily they're not role modeled by their mothers, but they have a lot of influence from the society. So I think we should blame the society. Even if a boy did not grow up with a present father, there is enough role modeling from men outside the single mother for this boy to acquire what it means to be a man for them. And so that is why I suggest that we need to blame the society, because it is the society that provides that role modeling for him to toughen up. The other question was about what are the psychological factors that lead to gender-based violence. I think patriarchy is the psychological factor that leads to gender-based violence. The sense of superiority of men, it's a psychological condition. And they get conditioned from very early on in life. And it's a problem. That is my answer for that question. But I want to touch on the other questions as well. There's a question about preparedness for boys to be a father and how that influences their denial of paternity. That is assuming that there's a study that suggests that in the Eastern Cape, only about 35% of children grow up with their mothers and fathers, even mothers. So mothers are also absent in their children's lives. But when girls fall pregnant, we don't ask the questions about how are they going to be good mothers, where did they learn to be mothers because they did not have mothers. So we have this sense that naturally a girl child will become a good mother or will be able to mother without seeing that being role modeled somewhere. But when it comes to men, we want to create conditions of perfect fatherhood by looking for a father who is a role model. And I think that's when we're playing double standards. And of course, we know why we're playing double standards, because patriarchy allows us to play double standards. The phenomenon of denying paternity is also not a class issue. I want to suggest that. One of my postgraduate students did work on that, and we also reading about it, that there are also middle-class men who also adopt this concept that we will see when the child is born if the child is man. So they want to delay until the child is born. So even people who have access to jobs. But also, if we're going to use money as a reason why men dispute and deny and contemplate thinking about whether this is their child, we've got to think about the concept of nets, not in education, not in employment, and not in training. In South Africa, we do have a problem of young people who are not in education and training and employment. However, of those, most of the people who are likely to not find jobs are still women. So in fact, we do not have a situation where a lot of men, when they are out of school, don't find jobs. A lot of people, the bulk of the people who makes up the nets in South Africa are women. So women are more likely to be unemployed in South Africa compared to their male counterparts. So I think that's where I want to leave it at, if I've answered the questions.
No, thank you. That was very useful, Mzikazi. Friends, we have about 3 minutes left for the webinar. We are coming towards the end. Let's have a look at the final polling results from the polling questions. So people feel that more education is needed and behavior change of men and boys is the most needed. Thank you. The next one, please. No, I think that was it. So given the time, again, just to thank you, both of our presenters, and I would like to give just 1 minute to each presenter for a closing comment. And I'll pass to Malose first, just for last words, and then to Mzikazi. Malose, please go ahead.
Thanks, Wessel, and again to the organizers and people that have attended this conversation, and obviously for me, I guess we also need to start negating, and which it's the theme of this webinars. How do we overcome toxic masculinity or toxic fatherhood, and the only way to negate that, it's by all of us committing in our public and private spaces to doing things differently. And I guess both men and women, for us to live in that dream world where men and women will able to live side by side and free of oppression and violence. And I regard this conversation as one of those contributions, and also the session next week and the session that we had last week.
Thank you so much, Malose. Mzi?
I agree with Malose. Thank you, Wessel.
Okay, so thank you for joining us, everyone. We would like to thank the Oak Foundation for making this webinar series possible. Next week, Wednesday, at the same time, we have part 3 called Fathers and the First 1,000 Days. Beverly Damonse from the National Research Foundation will moderate the session, and we will be joined by Mercy Manyema from the Centre of Excellence in Human Development, Zoheb Khan from IntelliDex, and Tawanda Makusha from the HSRC. Lastly, just to mention that this webinar is recorded, and we will make the link available for everyone who attended. Have a lovely evening, and pay it forward, as Malose has suggested. Thank you.